sometimes history feels, well, a bit distant, doesn't it? Like something you just read about.
Yeah, definitely.
But then you get something that just connects you directly. You shared this incredible letter with us from an American soldier right in the middle of the Boxer Rebellion in China back in 1900. Maybe not a conflict everyone knows loads about.
True.
And you also sent over some, really interesting historical articles, some academic stuff too.
Right. To give us the bigger picture.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, that's our mission really, to get inside this event, the Boxer Rebellion.
What it was, why it happened.
Why it kicked off, and what kind of impact it had. And we're starting with this soldier's own words, his firsthand view.
And it's fascinating, isn't it, how this one letter just throws us straight into the feeling of it. Something history books can sometimes smooth over.
Totally. His personal journey, his unfiltered thoughts.
Yeah.
It's a ground-level view we can then sort of stack up against the wider politics and economics.
Precisely. It gives it that human dimension.
Okay, let's really dig into this letter then. His trip to China. Wow, quite the journey. He starts in Manila, then stops in Nagasaki, Japan.
Yeah, and he was really impressed by Nagasaki.
He really was. Calls it one of the most beautiful places I ever saw. It's almost jarring, that kind of appreciation right before, all the conflict.
It is a moment of calm before the storm, perhaps.
Then it's on to Taku and finally Tientsin. And he makes this point, doesn't he, about the ship, the Indiana.
Oh, right. The same ship General Grant used for his world tour?
Yeah. Little unexpected historical footnote there.
It is, but it's maybe more than just trivia, It subtly links his own small part to this bigger American global story, even if he wasn't thinking about it like that.
Good point. And that peaceful moment in Nagasaki, it's such a stark contrast to what he finds next.
In Tientsin.
Yeah, his description of Tientsin really hits you. He paints this picture like the foreign areas are laid out, fine buildings, European style, macadamized streets, brick.
Very orderly, very Western.
Right. And then the Chinese city. Mud and clay, narrow and filthy streets.
A completely different world side by side.
But he does notice some nuance, right? He says the better class Chinese have imposing structures, stone and wood, courtyards. And he finds the temples, the joss houses, and other buildings very queer looking.
That word queer is telling, isn't it? Shows that cultural gap.
Definitely. It feels like these two worlds are just rubbing up against each other, and you can sense the friction building.
Absolutely. That visual divide he describes, it's basically a symbol of the whole problem. The foreign concessions represented Western power and intrusion. And his descriptions, even with maybe the biases of the time, they just underscore these massive differences in how things looked, how things were built, which really just stood for the bigger clash of cultures, of power. You can almost taste the resentment.
But wow, his reaction to seeing death, that's intense.
Yeah, that part is difficult to read.
Seeing the Chinese bodies, he talks about this fear, this horror of becoming a bloated, maggoty, stinking corpse himself.
And it makes him push for cremation right then and there.
Yeah, he becomes a staunch advocate.
Yeah.
And then he describes their own men, how quickly the bodies swelled and turned black in the heat. He uses really offensive language there, too.
He does. It's deeply disturbing, that intense focus on the physical decay, the dehumanizing language. It speaks volumes about the fear, the anxiety of dying so far from home in such, gruesome circumstances.
And the heat, the conditions.
Exactly. The sheer speed of decomposition must have been psychologically brutal for those soldiers. His sudden turn to wanting cremation, it's such a raw human reaction to witnessing something truly horrific. It just cuts through any kind of heroic narrative.
Yeah, it really does. And he talks about combat, too, the fighting between Tientsin and Pekin, suffering for water, his tongue swelling up. He lists soldiers dying from different units, 14th, 9th Marines.
Right, highlighting that multinational aspect of the force.
And even mentions a suicide. It's just a grim, unvarnished look at what it was actually like for the guys there.
It really brings it down to earth, doesn't it? Away from the abstract Boxer Rebellion and into the heat, the thirst, the death, the trauma faced by individuals, that mention of suicide is particularly chilling, hints at the sheer despair.
So, okay, this letter gives us that incredibly personal, grounded view.
Yeah.
But to really get what this soldier was part of, we need to, pull the lens back.
Understand the bigger picture.
Yeah. What was the Boxer Rebellion, fundamentally? What were they trying to achieve?
Well, at its core, it was this powerful backlash against foreigners, against imperialism. It was led by Chinese nationalists, the Boxers called that because of their martial arts practices.
Okay.
And their main goal, really, was to kick out all foreign influence from China. They felt Western powers were undermining everything: Chinese sovereignty, traditions, way of life.
Right. And what specifically pushed things to boiling point around 1900? What were the main complaints?
It was a whole mix of things building up for decades, really. There was this deep fear that Western countries were just carving up China, taking territory, forcing unfair deals, messing with Chinese courts.
So.
Plus, huge resentment over economic changes. Things like railways, introduced by foreigners, were disrupting traditional jobs and ways of making a living.
Okay, so political and economic anxieties.
Exactly. And then, critically, you had natural disasters. A massive Yellow River flood in '98, then a terrible drought in Shandong province in 1899-1900.
And people blame foreigners for that.
Some did, yeah. There was this idea that foreign presence, foreign buildings, railways were upsetting the natural harmony, the feng shui, and causing these disasters. So it wasn't just politics and economics. It felt like the natural order was being violated, too.
Wow. So it's this potent mix of grievances?
Yeah.
Who did the Boxers target first?
Initially, their anger was mainly directed at Chinese Christians.
Why them specifically?
Well, there was resentment. Some non-Christians saw them as getting special treatment or resources from the foreign churches, calling them race Christians, basically saying they converted for the material benefits, not real belief. And the attack started with, burning churches, destroying property, but then escalated horribly. Awful violence, murders of Chinese Christians.
That's terrible.
Yeah. Later, the focus widened. They started targeting foreign railway workers, merchant symbols of that Western disruption, and then missionaries themselves. A British missionary, Sidney Brooks, was killed late in 1899. That was a significant escalation.
And this spiral of violence eventually leads to the big event people often know about, the siege in Beijing.
Exactly. The siege of the Legation Quarter. Starting June 20th, 1900, the Boxers, along with some parts of the actual Chinese Imperial Army, surrounded the area where all the foreign diplomats and their staff lived.
Including the Americans.
Including the U.S. legation, yes. Diplomats, families, guards, and also quite a few Chinese Christians who'd fled there for safety.
And they held out for, how long was it?
An incredible 55 days, under constant attack, terrible conditions, until August 14th.
Wow. 55 days.
Yeah, and that's where you get stories of real heroism, like U.S. Marine Private Dan Daly defending a key part of the wall. Just incredible pressure.
The fear must have been overwhelming. And to finally break that siege, it wasn't just the U.S. acting alone, was it?
No, definitely not. It took a combined military force, the famous Eight-Nation Alliance.
All right, who was in that?
You had Austria, Hungary, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Russia, Great Britain, and the U.S. They all sent troops to march on Beijing and rescue the legations.
That's quite a coalition.
It is, but it's crucial to remember this was very much a marriage of convenience. These countries all had their own agendas, their own rivalries in China. There were already plenty of tensions between them. They united basically because they had to save their people and protect their interests in Beijing right then.
That makes sense. So the U.S. is part of this big international military force. But what were America's own reasons for getting involved in China like this? You mentioned their policy wasn't really about grabbing colonies like the Europeans.
That's right. The official U.S. line was the open door policy, wanting equal access for trade for everyone, not carving China up. But the Boxer Rebellion really shifted things. It pushed the U.S. towards direct military action to protect its citizens and its stake in China.
And what was that stake? What were the main drivers for the U.S.?
It was a mix, really. Economically, China was seen as this huge potential market for American goods, especially with U.S. industry producing surpluses. Plus, geographically, being across the Pacific, China was seen as a sort of strategic backdoor.
Okay. Trade and location. What else?
Religion was a big factor. There was a very active American missionary movement trying to convert Chinese people, seeing it as saving heathens.
Right.
And strategically, the U.S. didn't want any other power like Russia or Japan or Britain getting too dominant in China and shutting America out. So it was about keeping the door open for themselves, too.
So economics, religion, and sort of geopolitical strategy. And were there bigger ideas floating around in America at the time that played into this?
Oh, absolutely. Ideas like social Darwinism were really influential then. This notion of Anglo-Saxon superiority, the white man's burden.
Ah, that phrase.
Yeah. It fed into this sense, among some, that America had a duty, a civilizing mission, to uplift other nations, whether they wanted it or not.
Ah.
And that definitely colored how they viewed intervention in places like China.
And how did the American public see all this unfolding? What were the newspapers saying?
Well, the press had a huge impact. A lot of newspapers ran really sensational stories about Boxer atrocities. They used very racialized language, bloodthirsty barbarians, riotous hordes, that kind of thing.
Creating fear.
Exactly, creating fear and outrage, which made it easier to justify sending troops. But importantly, not everyone bought it.
Oh, yeah, there were critics.
Yes, definitely. People like Mark Twain were very outspoken against U.S. involvement.
Really? Mark Twain?
Yeah, he actually saw the Boxers as patriots fighting for their country against foreign invaders. He even compared them to the American revolutionaries.
Wow, that's a completely different take.
It is. And Twain also pointed out the hypocrisy, right? The U.S. intervening in China while treating Chinese immigrants so badly back home.
That's a powerful critique. It just shows how contested these things were, even at the time. And didn't Buffalo Bill get involved somehow?
Ah, yes. That's such a fascinating snapshot of popular culture. In 1901, Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, which was like the big entertainment spectacle, then added this huge reenactment called The Capture of Pekin.
A reenactment of the siege relief.
Pretty much. Hundreds of performers, costumes, noise, even artillery. It basically presented the whole thing as this heroic military triumph for the Allies. It really cemented that victorious narrative for ordinary America.
Shows how quickly a certain story can take hold. Okay, so the Eight-Nation Alliance puts down the rebellion. What happens next?
Boxer Protocol, right.
Exactly. The Qing government, totally defeated, was forced to sign the Boxer Protocol in 1901. And the terms were incredibly harsh, a massive humiliation for China.
What did it involve? The biggest thing was the indemnity. China was ordered to pay 450 million taels of silver, an absolutely enormous sum to the 8 nations over 39 years.
450 million taels. How much was that, relatively?
It was more than the Chinese government's entire annual income at the time, just crippling. The U.S. share was set at about 7.3%.
Just staggering. But didn't the U.S. do something unusual with its share later on? Something about returning money?
Yes, that's a really interesting part of the story. The U.S. government eventually figured out that the amount they'd claimed actually exceeded the real costs and damages suffered by Americans.
Oh, so they overestimated.
Pretty much. And several things came together. President Theodore Roosevelt talked about wanting American-directed reform in China. There was lobbying for missionaries, plus worries about a growing Chinese boycott of American goods because of discrimination back in the U.S.
Okay.
So recognizing that returning the excess could be a smart move, improve relations, boost America's image globally, they decided to remit the surplus back to China.
And that money went into the scholarship program.
Precisely. The Boxer Indemnity Scholarship Program. The U.S. earmarked the returned funds specifically for educating Chinese students in America.
What was the thinking behind that?
Well, the idea was strategic, really. Create a generation of Chinese leaders in science, engineering, medicine, commerce who were educated in the U.S., felt some goodwill towards America, and would hopefully favor U.S. interests when they went back home.
Soft power, almost.
You could say that. MIT was a popular place for these students. Between 1909 and 1937, over 1,300 students came over through this program. And later funds helped set up things like the China Foundation and the China Institute in New York.
So it was part goodwill, but definitely had a strategic edge. How was it received in China?
It was actually seen as a really positive gesture, quite unprecedented at the time, returning indemnity money. It definitely boosted America's reputation in China, made the U.S. look fair, maybe even friendly compared to some other powers.
So it bought them some genuine goodwill.
It did. The Chinese minister in Washington at the time even expressed hope that other nations would follow America's example. It set the U.S. apart, in a way.
But, and there's always a but in history, isn't there?
Usually, yes.
Despite this gesture, the reality was still pretty complicated. That Eight-Nation Alliance wasn't exactly a band of brothers.
Not at all. As we said, loads of competing interests, and cooperation was strained. After the fighting stopped, there were widespread reports of looting and violence by Allied troops in Tianjin and Beijing.
By all the Allied troops, including Americans.
Unfortunately, yes. U.S. soldiers were implicated, along with soldiers from other nations. Even some missionaries got caught up in looting. There's a specific case of a U.S. Marine court-martialed for rape and assault, which led General Chaffee, the U.S. commander, to issue orders cracking down hard on that kind of behavior.
So definitely not a clean, heroic intervention all around.
Far from it.
And did the U.S. military stick around in China afterwards?
They did. The Boxer Protocol actually gave foreign powers the right to station troops in certain areas, including Beijing, to protect their legations and ensure communication lines stayed open. So the U.S. maintained a military presence for years to protect American interests, as allowed by the treaty.
Right. And you mentioned a boycott earlier, a Chinese boycott of U.S. goods.
Yes, the 1905 boycott. That was a direct response to how Chinese people were being treated in the United States.
Ah, the Exclusion Act.
Exactly. The Chinese Exclusion Act kept being renewed and strengthened, severely limiting immigration. Plus, incidents like the forced quarantine of San Francisco's Chinatown during a plague outbreak seen as blatant racism.
The deep resentment was still there.
Absolutely. The boycott showed that despite the indemnity remission, these underlying issues of discrimination and unfair laws created real anger and tension in the relationship. It really complicates that simple narrative of American generosity.
It really does. It's fascinating how this deep dive, starting with that one soldier's letter, just opens up this incredibly complex picture.
Totally. The Boxer Rebellion itself was this huge moment, Chinese nationalism pushing back against foreign imperialism.
And the U.S. role was messy, driven by economics, strategy, ideas about civilization.
A real tangle of motives. And the soldier's letter, like you said, it just grounds it all. It shows us the human cost, the fear, the cultural clashes, right there on the page.
So as you can see from looking at all these different sources, the personal letter, the history books, the academic analysis, you really need all those angles to get a proper feel for what happened.
You really do. You need the individual stories and the big picture context.
Which brings us to maybe a final thought to chew on. You think about that soldier, his surprisingly positive first impression of Japan.
Yeah, which would later become a major U.S. rival.
Right. And then you have this relationship with China, partly shaped by those Boxer scholarships intended to build friendship, but always complex, always tied up with U.S. interests.
And ongoing tensions.
Exactly. It makes you wonder, doesn't it, how these small interactions, these policy choices like returning the indemnity, how they ripple outwards through history in ways no one could have predicted.
Yeah, the law of unintended consequences, maybe.
Perhaps. What does it tell us about international conflict, about cultural exchange, about the long shadow cast by decisions made in moments of crisis? Something to think about.